Hello and welcome to another episode of Astropraxis. My name is Natasha, and as always, I am joined by my wonderful co-hosts and astrologers, Rhiannon, Tawa, and Brett. And today we're going to talk about Saturn and Neptune and the mystical archetypes that are showing up in our visible space. And I want to thank my co-host for indulging me on a little bit of a train ride that my brain has been going on. And so I'm just
Mhm.
going to share a little presentation here that I have. And I've kind of named it A New Age of Spirituality Made Visible. And I just want to kind of introduce this from the perspective of being a student of astrology. I'm always in reflective of this space because astrology amazes me on a daily basis, especially when you can become aware of the archetypes and see them play out in front of you. Even those ones that, are challenging, it's still, when you see them come up, it is really amazing to see. And so this was inspired actually by a presentation by Adam Allenboss at Nightlight Astrology. And so shout out to him. He's a great inspiration for, the work I think that we all do in our training and studying. And so last year, when Saturn and Neptune were about to conjoin in the sign of Aries, he had a fantastic panel discussion with seven plus amazing astrologers. And they talked about what they might see at this time when Saturn and Neptune conjoin in this sign. It was going to be something brand new. It was something that we hadn't seen before because they would conjoin at zero Aries. And so there were a lot of different theories and thoughts about what we might see. And one of the points was about this new age of spirituality. And I thought that was really fascinating. Maybe new forms of religion being formed, and people exploring different forms of spirituality and faith. And so this talk was also inspired by the the solar eclipse in Aquarius that happened on February 17th. And so on this day, this was in the forefront of my mind because of things that other people had spoken up about in social media that it aligned with other global events and spiritual and cosmological events, being things like the Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year, the start of Ramadan, the start of Lent. Mahashivaratri was also within those days. And so for me, the way I see my social media or how information comes to me is that if it has, gone through the barriers of my niche um, social media feed, then it has actually grown quite big and it is getting very large. And that means it's reaching a lot of people. And one of the things that Adam has spoken about is when you look at the archetypes of planets as they move into new signs, some of the loudest representations come at those early degrees. And so when you can be aware of them and pay attention to them, you can see some really amazing examples of this. And so for me, I know we all expected Saturn and Neptune and Aries to be some pretty dark times, some pretty challenging times. And I will, in a moment, read a couple of quotes from a wonderful book, Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas, as he talks about how this is a cyclical pattern of Saturn and Neptune together. They bring a lot of challenges, a lot of malaise, and a lot of pushing people to limits. So it was interesting to see some of these things come up and look at the patterns of these archetypes. And as he talks about the archetypes of the planets being multivalent, what I wanted to focus on today in this episode is that while there are some pretty dark and challenging archetypes or shadows of the archetypes in of Saturn and Neptune, there is also some positive potential for what can come out of these two planets working together in the sign of Aries. And being that it was at the start of the solar eclipse, this time of renewal in Aquarius, which was, is already was co-present with Pluto. So we see this rise of information and change of technological information and reaching, beyond borders. We see the archetypes come alive in some really amazing and positive ways. Um, and so I'm going to throw it over to Rhiannon to talk a little bit about uh, the archetypes of Saturn and how it actually really applies to our topic today of reaching out for um, some spiritual guidance.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. So when you had asked us, think about what this all these events, like what is the commonality, like what archetype or planet would do you tie into this? The first image that came to my mind was Saturn. And I thought, like, I want to talk about this because I know that like Saturn through like Capricorn, for example, I have a sister, a couple sisters who have their sun in Capricorn, and one of them told me once, like I just like I'm not really proud of the fact that I have the sun in Capricorn. Like it to me, it's just I feel so austere. I feel like it's just this like, it's the least exciting like such like sign that, you could have as your sun and when we think about Capricorn's like archetypes through Saturn, we think about like, the limitations or the setbacks or like how we basically how we like, you know, how we are limited or how it's like it can seem like severe and just like harsh. But there's this side to Saturn that I think we don't always look at. And this is what Adam was talking about in his podcast, The Mystical Saturn, that I thought was, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I was thinking of when I was thinking of Saturn. Or this is where I was going with this and didn't really know it at the time. So I just want to point out that in the Chaldean order here, we have like the moon, the Mercury, Venus in the order that the planets in the order of their speed. We have Saturn is that last planet that connects us to like out it's almost takes us out of beckons us out of our physical world and into our spiritual into a spiritual sense, like beyond that is like the fixed stars or beyond that, like outside of our physical body. And I just thought it's so fascinating that in the chakra systems, the chakra, yep, the crown chakra that we would associate with the boundary between our physical world and the spirit world, how similar these two appear. So if we're looking at like the crown chakra, which is our connection to spirit, and Saturn at that top, in the Chaldean order as well, like basically, creating that boundary, between our physical bodies and the spiritual worlds. I just found that fascinating as, an example of how Saturn isn't you know, in the mud, just, in the trenches all the time. Obviously, it is that too, but it has that dual nature to it. And I really like what Adam said in this just really pulled it all together for me in his talk on the mystical Saturn. He said it's the watcher of the gateway. Saturn is the watcher of the gateway of eternity on the threshold of time. And that's just really depicted here, like as it sits on the top, like between that threshold of our physical bodies and spiritual worlds. So
Yeah, that's
that's what I have to say
fantastic.
about that. And yeah.
Love that. Yeah, and I think it's just wonderful because when we think of Saturn, we think of how much it constrains us, and yet it is like the bridge that kind of if we reach it, we can get to that other side. So we have to get to it. We have to go through it. Um, and it's the resilience of going through it, right? Um, anybody, anybody
Yeah,
have
I
any
was just
thoughts
going to
on that?
say that, you think about boundaries too and the importance of boundaries because we don't, you have to have a boundary to even move into the process of reaching beyond.
Right,
So we bump into a boundary and it feels like a constriction or it feels like a limitation or it feels like something that is making it so that we can't move in a certain direction, but we wouldn't even know to move in that direction if we didn't have something that we bump into that signals
yeah,
that we're moving in that direction.
yeah,
So it's so critical, it's like you have to have a door to open,
yeah,
and Saturn
hmm
provides that.
yeah. The threshold, right? The gateway to the
Yeah.
gods. So,
Mhm.
yeah. And I'm just going to move into some significations of Saturn and Neptune. As Rhiannon had referred to Adam's amazing talk on the mystical Saturn that we all highly recommend everybody go and watch if you want a better understanding of Saturn. Um, and so, he talked about there is this overlap of Saturn and Neptune. There are many qualities that they share, being an outcast, having this sense of longing, as Tawa had expressed, is that you don't know where you want to go next until you reach that boundary. And then when you reach that boundary, it's always, well, wait, there's a boundary here. What is on the other side of that wall? And so there is a longing and yearning um, for the boundary and then beyond the boundary, right? And so we look at it, them both as this impermanence, sense of impermanence. It's a bridge. I think, it's Saturn. It you have to, it like hands you over, because Saturn is not only the middle, um, or sorry, it's not just a boundary, it's just what's inside the boundary and then just what's outside the boundary and then the boundary itself, which is that liminal space in between. And I think this is why we have um, Saturn is in its joy in the 12th house, which is a liminal space, and that's that boundary just before, incarnation and birth in the first house. And so it's a weird and awkward place to be when you're in that middle. But once you get through that, there is this beautiful side of transcendence that you can get from Neptune. And of course, we know without containment, without a container, this is what happens with Saturn, is that without a container in Neptune, is that, freedom is wonderful, but we do need containers. And I think some of the things that have led us to this point of searching for new spiritual faiths is that, especially in the West, with what we've been seeing, and actually not just in the West, it's everywhere really, but is that we have lost our leadership. And so without leadership, we've lost a sense of containment. The rules that we used to have in place are no longer rules that seem to make sense. And so there is no containment of rules and structure in place. And while that is wonderful because it feels like you're breaking away from the chains of those rules, it also is scary because then that means if there's no rules, where are we? And that's where I think individually you are brought up to this question. And so I had, Saturn is the small R of reality, is the reality of our material world that we're in. Whereas Neptune is that big R of reality, is that when we are met with those limitations of the existence of being here on Earth, which I think we are all either been forced to confront or are in the process of confronting with the realities that we see and the atrocities we see in the world. Then we start asking ourselves, what is our personal limits, of believing what we believe, seeing of understanding the world as we choose to understand it. One of the things I wanted to kind of point out that is really important is this idea of dissolving boundaries with this kind of growth of spiritual. I'm going to call it like a spiritual wave. Is that because of Pluto and Aquarius, this free form, this growth of spirit of technology, We've seen cultural boundaries break down. We've seen national boundaries break down in the ability to access what is special and personal and ancient in those cultures. And so I wanted to bring up, when we look at the positives of the potential and the positive and the potential for Saturn or Neptune is that with people reaching their limits, they're looking for, something that we have lost. We have lost the ability or the practice of ritual. We have lost praxis. We have lost stillness. We've lost devotion. We've lost joy and compassion. And so Saturn and Neptune, while it brings a lot of the difficult things, it can also turn us to change our mindsets and cultivate this for ourselves. And that's the discipline of Saturn. And very quickly, I was listening to a podcast, to the Young Life podcast recently, which is also a phenomenal podcast to listen to. And Joseph Lee had discussed something that Carl Jung was trying to express about the age of Aquarius, being that it would require a powerful dissolving of the old thing in order to strengthen humanity. We have to have this powerful dissolving, and that is reaching our limits. And also a very powerful activation of a new energy. And that would allow for the collective awareness and to demand accommodation. And this is something that Joseph Lee has said on his podcast. I just want to give him credit to that because it was just it gave me such wonderful insight for this talk. There's a couple of quotes here by Richard Tarnas, and I'm just going to read maybe one or two of them just to show the multivalency of these, what's that, multivalency, or the multivalent nature of these archetypes. But before I do that, does anybody have anything they would like to toss in or say?
Yeah, I just want to talk about Aries a little bit, right?
Yes,
I
thank you.
think it's important when we're just talking about both of the planets and how they're in Aries right now. So, yeah, Aries is the masculine home or temple of Mars. This is Mars's fast, initiatory, and decisive expression. And so, although the act of initiating or pioneering has its perks, there's also a price you pay for being first, right? So, like starting something or leading the way can create a feeling of vulnerability or isolation. And so while Saturn and Neptune is in Aries, I think this can speak to themes of vulnerability and the courage that is necessary to work through it. So Aries is like really about the present. And I think this time can speak to a deep period of reflection as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. It's so important because Saturn and Neptune is one part of it, but it's the drive of Aries, right? And like you said, there's a vulnerability being first one out. There's also that drive, and so thank you for bringing that up. It's so important to this discussion. So given that, I'm just going to, knowing that, as Aries being the stage that we're in with that's going to host Saturn and Neptune, therefore Mars being the host of Saturn and Neptune's archetypes. I'm just going to read maybe through a couple of quotes here by Richard Tarnas about typically what Saturn and Neptune time periods and aspects can look like. And so this can, include in history, they could be oppositions, they could be conjunctions, they could be squares. And so a couple of things that he has said is, issues surrounding skepticism, generally, the discernment of truth and illusion, and the confronting of deception and delusion frequently emerge. We know that this has been a common theme, especially over the last few months, of all kinds of information, via Pluto and Aquarius coming at us. And so there is this, with that information coming in, it's kind of knocking at our door of the collective consciousness of how we now interpret that information. So we see here, as often occurs during Saturn and Neptune alignments, the hidden shadow of past actions and policies became visible, haunting the present. In wartime, Saturn-Neptune alignments coincide with later stages of a war when a collective sense of physical and spiritual exhaustion, disillusionment, and low morale, often on both sides, is dominant. And so there are many parts to the Saturn and Neptune periods that are generally of difficulty, of strife, of malaise. And we know we were expecting those things, but I wanted to point out that on that, with that, there is also what happens when we are pushed into those states of being. And so he said, paradoxically, such periods tend to coincide with collective expressions of opposite sides of the same complex, loss of faith and disillusionment, but also forging a deeper faith in the face of harsh or tragic realities. The latter response can take many forms: a search to discover a foundation of hope in a greater, though not yet visible, reality, an inward turning withdrawal from the world to contact inner spiritual resources and ideals, a strengthened commitment to religious tradition, a turning to spiritual discipline and practice, ritual, prayer, and meditation. And so it says frequently the experience or witness of suffering serves to dissolve rigid boundaries and past enmities and to call forth unitive and compassionate healing and impulses. And this is what I wanted to bring up now, because this is kind of the parts of these archetypes that we don't always like to pay attention to. We stick to the negative planetary archetypes and don't know or don't necessarily have the capacity or maybe the bandwidth to always see there are other things, there are other parts to these archetypes also playing out. And so for me, I saw, I just happened to see or came through my social media feed these examples and acts of spirituality that for me was surprising and different. And it all happened around the same time. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of examples. If anybody has anything that they would love to jump in and say, just kind of cut me right off. Otherwise, I'll jump into a few examples of what inspired me to talk about this. Okay. So spirituality made visible. So these are little things that I think that when you know that these planets have multiple ways of seeing them, archetypes, that they're multivalent, is pay attention to what's happening around you, and sometimes those quiet things will evolve to something bigger. So by the time Neptune has finished its time in Aries, or by the time Saturn has finished its time in Aries, we might see another expressive growth of what has started now or has been starting and made visible now. So one of the things I first noticed, and I know that the Hallow app came out, I believe maybe a couple of years ago, so I don't know the exact date on that. But for me, what was interesting was that on the day of the solar eclipse, which we know coincided with Lent, that I happened to see, or it came into my algorithm of this app for Hallow, where it was encouraging those who were going to follow the practice of Lent, they can follow along with this. And I think this is really amazing because what we're seeing here is, oops, sorry, I'm going to go back one. What we're seeing here is, the faith of Mark Wahlberg and Chris Pratt, and Jonathan Rumi, who I'm not completely familiar with, but him. Let me go back to my screen.
You're still on that screen.
Am I still on the slide screen?
Yeah, you're still on the slide with Mark Wahlberg.
Okay. My screen has just changed, and so interesting. Sorry, just one moment, everyone. This is some strange. Issue here. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing it just for a quick second, and then I go back into it. Sorry, my mistake. We're all good here? Everybody can see?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good.
So anyway, so that looking at this, I thought this was really interesting. I know I'm not completely familiar with their religious faith, but I do know that Chris Pratt has spoken and is outspoken about his devotion to Christianity. And so I thought this was really nice, an interesting way. And, however you want to come to the just how celebrities practice and share their faith, it's completely up to you. I'm just kind of seeing this as an example of this is really nice that somebody is sharing a way for people to become connected to the divine. Okay. So my next example is SZA, and this was one of those ones that I was really surprised about, and it made me smile, and I just thought it was wonderful to see. And this was during the Isha Foundation had put on a wonderful it was live streamed globally, but this like 6 hour event for Mahashivratri this past year, and she attended and she was on stage, and I'll tell you, the reaction was really favorable for her. I think people just loved seeing her joy on that stage, and so this is, we see an American um performer, adopting and these new faiths, but also sharing the joy of those faiths. And it was interesting. A few days later, I happened to see a post by Isha USA, and she did a little promo for them to talk about, gratitude and her practice, the yoga, her practice of the yoga tradition. She was also on Sesame Street talking about gratitude, and I just wanted to throw that in there because I think that was an extension of that practice. We also saw the benevolent monks from Texas walking, during the Walk for Peace, their Walk for Peace campaign, which was probably one of the most powerful examples, I think transformative examples for so many people around the world to see this group of 20 monks walk for 110 days. I might get that wrong, and consistently share their expression and joy for developing a compassionate mind, not only for themselves, or for yourself, but for other people, and to always teach people to remind themselves that they can always have a peaceful day. And of course, we have my buddy here, my friend Aloka, who also, I think, expanded that spiritual connection because so many people had connected to him. And animals and spirituality is a whole other topic I'll speak to another day. A second version of this where we see spirituality made visible is Disney Plus's airing of a reality competition show called The Battle of Fates. And this also really fascinated me because it was interesting to see a variety of divinations and spiritual practices coming together in a Western in a Western environment and being shared in such a positive way. And so I think what it did, and I'm going to, inspired by something Adam said recently, is, it exposes a larger audience to a buffet, so to speak. Not to diminish what the practices are, but a variety of forms of divination. And a lot of people are really, I think, enjoying it. I don't know of any controversies or anything else like that. Either way, it is coming into the forefront. I have a lot of thoughts too about how this expresses in the Western world, but I think that just showing up is it's showing that spirituality is growing in the forefront of the public. And this topic, which requires an entire episode on its own, so I'm going to touch on this very briefly. And with all the respect to the anime fans out there, I know a little bit about anime, but the one thing that I've noticed is the connection and the influence to spiritual practices from Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism. I think there's way more that I, respectfully don't know. That there's entire audiences that are being exposed to spiritual practices. And through these narratives and this stunning forms of visual storytelling. And here's an example of Jujutsu Kaisen showing domain expansions. And they use that, and they're doing it through the mudras, of a Buddhist practice of hand gestures that, express energy. So I know that anime has been around for a long time. I know that they have I've noticed a lot of deep spiritual, esoteric content in a lot of anime. And so this is not even doing it justice, but I think that there's been a lot of generations that are being exposed to spiritual practices that they don't know that are real practices. And my next example is the Mountain, which is an album that was released by the Gorillaz. And this was just recently over the last couple of months. I don't remember the exact dates, but this was done in devotion to the cultural practices and religious faiths in India. And the Gorillaz have produced this album in such wonderful devotion to the practices, based on their own expression of grief and personal experiences. And one moment here. Okay. And this last example here I have is The Philosopher's Kitchen for Jung Kwang. And I apologize. I hope I didn't mispronounce that. But she is a benevolent monk in Korea and is a well-renowned temple chef. And I think that there's been a highlight about Korean cooking and temple cooking and talking about our consumption and looking at the consumption of food, and not just food, but the consumption of food as a spiritual practice, and what it brings in are the elements of earth, water, air, and fire. And we see here embodying earth, water, sunlight, and wind on the ad for the show. This being brought onto Netflix, I think, is also, again, kind of encouraging people to look at what they do as a daily practice and to approach their daily practice through a different lens. So, although I don't have a lot of the examples here right now, I do think that we have seen flourishes of this spiritual expression. I think that when we are faced with the atrocities of the world, we have been locked to the limits of our own psyche, of our own moral and ethical, religious, faith-based, personal, whatever belief you might have. And we start to look at that belief and say, okay, I have this belief, what's on the other side of it? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen there for a second. But I think that this expression of spirituality that we've seen and the cross cultures of spirituality is something that's going to develop and grow. And that by the time Neptune leaves Aries, I think we're going to see, even by the time Saturn leaves Aries, we're going to see a different world of spiritual practice. So, yeah.
Well, it's made me realize it's kind of interesting because, my own personal spiritual seeking has been, active for at minimum a couple decades, probably more like 3 decades at this point. But so it's interesting it's very interesting and fun to witness such an expansion of it, and just seeing that things that 10 years ago were, that you couldn't express certain things to people and they wouldn't have understood what you were talking about. I would imagine today talking about chakras, the average audience has at least heard the term, whereas 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. But it's made me realize today, it's like, what is this? How is this planetary influence impacting those of us who have been building a spiritual practice for a long time, or
Mm,
have already done that inward exploration and transition to wanting to have an inner connection with spirit. And it made me realize, because a lot of what I'm experiencing lately is not that, because that's already really well established in my daily practices and my daily rituals and my, I'm very much doing that. I don't make a decision without connecting with myself and spirit to make a decision, I even little decisions. And so, but what I'm noticing is that play of boundaries and how those bumping against those boundaries does create a desire to seek beyond.
Mm.
And so the way that it's, interestingly enough, the way it's playing out for me is having to really, really, and I think we see this with the monks, and we see it with actually most of the examples that you see, is that it's people are putting it into practice
Yeah.
mm,
more externally, right? So it's becoming, I've lived this way because it's what works for me, and it's how I live peacefully and with contentment and non-attachment and all of those things. But what I'm noticing is that I'm having to put it into practice a whole lot more, that those
Mm.
are the boundaries I'm bumping into, is recognizing that um, it's not quite enough for me to just live in alignment with myself, but that I need my networks, my alliances, my
Mm.
groups, my everythings to be in more alignment also. And that has
mm.
that
Mm.
has really been amplified. And it's interesting, because I was thinking, as you were discussing, as you were talking us through things, that my natal Saturn is in my 11th house, which is, alliances, networks, dreams and aspirations. It's, and so even though Saturn is moving through Aries and activating all of this, it feels like it is also activating Saturn, where it falls for me personally. And it makes me curious as to other people where their Saturns are. And Brett, you mentioned that you're feeling some Saturn activity around your part of the chart with natal Saturn. And so it just is that
Yeah.
that additional layer of how it's going to impact us, is that we're having this great collective um, experience of it, and then it's going to trickle down into the more the minutia and the more personal of, like, oh, this is how it's showing up in my life.
Mhm.
And I didn't, it was great, so thank you, because I didn't really even have that sense of, like, oh, that's what's going on here, is
Mm.
that now it's no longer enough. Like I would, this is just a personal example, but when I practiced yoga and got very into yoga philosophy, and because and I loved it, because it was the first time I'd read something that resonated so deeply and aligned so deeply with just my natural inclinations and my natural sense of the world and how it fits. Um, but I also, will laugh at myself and say that for 10 years, for the first 10 years of practicing yoga and studying yoga philosophy, I was just accumulating knowledge, because
Mm.
there were some really, really big life changes that I was going to have to make if I was going to
Mm.
actually practice the wisdom and live the wisdom of it.
Mhm.
And I wasn't ready to make those shifts yet. And then at a certain point I was, and it created a very substantial restructuring of my life. But I had to go through the phase of just accumulating the information and understanding theoretically before I could put it into practice. And now I feel like that ante has been upped, like, exponentially, to, like, okay, Tawa, yes, you've learned how to live in alignment with yourself. And now you have to learn how to live in alignment with yourself so much that you're in alignment with all of your interactions. You're setting boundaries, requiring others to be in alignment with you if they're gonna interact with you, and if they're not, then probably there's going to be tension and a dissolution of those interactions. You know. So anyway, it's just been interesting to observe that.
Yeah.
Yeah. If anything, Tower, you're talking about like how um it could speak to like where Saturn is in your chart. And so at least for me personally, I have Saturn in the sixth, so there's like a sextile going on. So it's like working, at least for me personally, it's like working with sixth house topics, like um the the daily work that we do, taking care of your body and things like that. I think at least for me, that's how um this transit has been manifested in my life. And I also wanted to say like Saturn and Aries is just such a unique um um expression of Saturn, right? And because it's in its fall, so like it just doesn't feel as comfortable there. Um and obviously like when planets are in their fall, there's like a polarization with it. But this one seems like really polarized. Like Aries is so initiatory and so decisive and so pioneering, and Saturn is so reflective in nature.
Mm.
And so it's going to be interesting to see how that continues to manifest um, personally, and then also just like in the world as this transit continues to go on.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, one of the things, so I have Saturn in the first, and so when it was in Pisces, and I think that's why also this became forefront in my view because I myself have been, I think, starting a spiritual practice. So unlike Tao, who had a spiritual practice in place, and now it's like, okay, you already have the basic, now level up from there. I didn't have a spiritual practice and or even the practice. Like, like I think about some of the, just developing something and it happened to be, the influence of these things, watching the monks every day became a practice. It became, especially when you have those moments of being anger, feeling anger. I would check my social media and I would see them walking and I'm thinking, they're walking in peace. I don't have to be angry, right? I can choose not to be, I can have a peaceful day. And so that kind of rolled out, but then it was, even Adam spoke about this, and I'll kind of plug his daily quiet that he holds every day at 9:30 for about 20 minutes. Sundays are different, but establishing that practice for his community, I think that has been an incredibly impactful practice for me. And he talked about the idea too, is that, with Aries, he's been talking about this for a while, is that there's going to be this pull to rush forward. We're in a fire horse year. So there is this like this drive just to run really fast and into wherever you want to go, or just like feel that momentum. And Saturn is saying, and you can see this through all these examples of these practices, wherever you want to go, you're kind of moving towards this kind of this greatness, or maybe even relief, or maybe even something to kind of take us away from this darkness, is that you have to walk there slowly, one foot at a time, sometimes barefoot. And that is a practice. It is not a quick pill. It is not a pharmaceutical. It's not a one-off. It's not a single tarot reading. It's not a single astrology reading. It's not a one-off divination. Go to a medium or whatever. Those people that practice this do this as a devotion and a practice. And so Saturn, while you have the drive, that's the beauty of Saturn, is going to take that drive and say, yes, let's keep the drive slow and consistent, one step at a time, and you will get there. But that's the thing with us, is that we are, as the sun is in Aries and it's exalted in Aries and Mars is going to be moving in, there is going to be that increased drive to push forward. And I think this is where we have to be grateful for Saturn to say, no, slow down, keep pace, do what you're doing, don't run ahead of the line because you're not going to get anywhere, right? If you want to get there, you got to walk through it slowly. And I feel like doing this meditation practice has helped, like little things like my back's been out of order. And so like I'm using it to try to like fix my posture. And at the beginning, it was like all over the place. I couldn't figure out what I was doing. Now I can feel slowly it has been building up to a greater strength in my back just to sit quietly because I had to practice it. And with Jupiter in Virgo and Saturn in Virgo, there's always that push and pull. So there's always that need to run forward. But um, yeah, I think that's the blessings of Saturn that we don't realize is the practice. Praxis. Yeah.
All right.
What do you guys think? Any other thoughts?
I just think it's fascinating that, Saturn being in Aries, like Aries doesn't ask for permission. So we're gonna have, I mean, it's just interesting to see the examples that you gave, Natasha, of like all of the this the spiritual the examples of the spiritual paths that people are taking, like where they may not necessarily have been in those situations, like they wouldn't, like SZA going to like India, and people that we're seeing, that it just seems like it's not what we normally see, I suppose you could say. But yeah, it's just interesting how Aries just doesn't, we're just gonna see, like, we're gonna try anything and everything. And like,
Yeah.
I just find that
Yeah.
kind of fascinating. So yeah.
Yeah, me
Is
too.
Saturn in Aries a little bit like, and we may have talked about this, like because Aries is so initiatory in nature and Saturn is like that boundary, it's like let's go head first into the unknown a little bit. And to me, I feel like collectively that's a lot of like what we're going through right now
Hmm.
and we're going
Yeah.
to continue to go
Yeah.
through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like,
And then, sorry, go ahead, Tella.
well, it's like Aries is saying, let's just get there. And then Saturn's saying, and then I'll figure out the details, I guess.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, and then I'll figure out how to make it work there,
Yeah.
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 So,
And I think along the way, I think we all have to try to find what's going to keep us resilient, right?
yeah,
Like, right, Tala, as you're saying, like you have a practice in place.
right.
That is still like, the thing that keeps you. Yeah. So
But
And
it
those
is
things are so
also,
important.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. You got it.
no, you're fine. And they are so important. But I just was going to say that even with those practices, this is a super challenging time
Yeah.
for me. So
Yeah.
I can imagine that's a big part of why there is this flourishing of practices and seeking and turning inward, and because everybody's feeling, what it is, whatever the goo is that we're feeling,
Yeah.
and so there's an urgent need, like there's a really strong need to find something that will create, you use the word container, so I think it's trying to find a healthy, sustainable container for life, because so many systems have broken down and been completely dismantled, intentionally. But there's just really truly, which I guess that's the positive, even when it's maybe fascistic in nature, the positive of things being broken down is that there's empty space there. So new things can be built into that space. So anyway,
And
those are my
and
thoughts.
I'd also say that another positive about um Aries is the amount of focus that Aries has. I think Aries sometimes gets the misconception that it just like goes head first, like aimlessly, like doesn't think about things. But I think there's like a direct focus, there's the Marsy way about going about things.
Yeah.
It's like an intense focus into
Hmm.
something, and there's a positive about that.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of
Yeah.
intentionality with Aries.
Yeah.
And I feel that even gets strengthened with Saturn in
Yeah.
Saturn in that
Mm.
mix, because then Saturn's like, well, let's do something with this. Like, let's actually make this something that has a foundation, you know?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So those
That's
are pretty strong drives together. Yeah.
Hmm. It's
absolutely. That's why I love
quite
the
intimidating.
dignities.
Sorry, go ahead.
Mm.
The
I was just gonna
dignity.
say that's why I love the dignities because a lot of
Hmm.
them get a misconception of like, oh, you have this planet and its fall, like it's all gonna be terrible. Like, no, like it's gonna be uncomfortable in some ways because it's not at home, but there's definitely
Mhm.
some positives that you can get out of um that placement or that can manifest
Hmm.
from that placement.
Yeah.
There's a
Well,
lot
like
of
you can think of it
thinking
being,
outside the box that has to happen when
yeah,
something is not,
Absolutely.
well
yeah,
dignified. It's like, okay, so how do
yeah,
I make this work? And so
that's right.
it allows for a lot of inventiveness and
Yeah. I was
innovative
gonna
ways of
say,
thinking about things.
Yeah. And I think that's
yeah.
really like, what people can do right now too is when they think about this whole Saturn and Neptune in Aries is, yeah, shit. It's terrible, right? Like it's bad. But we can hold it. And as we've heard before, like, holding, two things can be true. You can hold that and still create. And I think that's where there's that Neptune and Saturn in Aries is we're in a lot of that goo that you can create from the goo. It's just that you're in the goo. So so creating that requires like, I mean, how do you move within that? You have to find resilience and personal strength to create something from that. So there's potential if we choose to see it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, love
Awesome.
that.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
guys. Thank you
Yeah.
for
Thank you.
Thank you.
going on this ride with me because that was fun and it was like a pain in my brain that I needed to let out. So I appreciate it. So, with that, I'm going to end our episode for today. I don't even know what the number of our episode. Are we in 7 or 8? Is
This
anything
is
I think
6.
it's fun. Oh, is
6?
it 6?
Okay,
Okay.
This is
okay, I was
6.
Nice.
ahead of
Yeah.
myself. Okay, so that's great. So this is our 6th episode. For those of you who are watching, thank you for coming out and watching us. We all appreciate it. We hope you come back. Make sure to like and subscribe. And for today, we're going to sign off and say, see ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Enjoy.
Peace.